In this tutorial, we'll be focusing more on adding motion to the environment of our illustrations, while adding a bit of motion to the character as well. I've got my PSD separated into the appropriate layers to easily add motion, and I'm ready to import this into After Effects. Double-click in the project panel, select My PSD, and click OK. I will ensure Layer Options is set to Editable Layer Styles. By checking the composition settings, we see the size of our composition is huge, and it's sitting at 6,000 pixels by 6,000 pixels. We'll correct this by running a script. Go to File, Scripts, then Scale Composition, and I'll size this down to about 1400 pixels. The Puppet Warp Pin tool is the first way I'm going to add motion to the environment. When using the Puppet Warp Pin tool, it can become very easy to get a bit overwhelmed by the amount of pins and corresponding keyframes and whatnot. To simplify this, I'm going to add all of the pins that will have no movement first. I want the trees to appear to be blowing in the wind, just having the tops of the trees moving while the base of the trees kind of stay still. All along the base of the tree line will not have any movement, so I'm adding these pins first. After they're all added, I come down to my timeline, select the layer, and press Hotkey U. This will reveal all the keyframe properties for this layer. Since I know none of these pins will have movement, I can click and drag to select the keyframes and delete them. Select the layer again, press Hotkey U to close the properties. Now I'll add the remaining pins that will have movement. After adding in my new pins, I'm going to move the pin to the starting point of the movement, then move the timeline indicator, and move the pin to where I want the movement to end. I do want this motion to continue throughout the entire composition, so I'm adding in a loop out expression by holding Alt-Option to open the Expressions dialog box and typing loop out. That's not quite what I was looking for. I want the loop to bounce back and forth between two keyframes, so I can add ping pong to the expression. Let's watch the playback. Alright, and lastly, add easy ease to the keyframes, hotkey F9. I've continued this process for all the small trees in the background, and here we can see the end result. It's looking pretty good. I may go back and change the timing a bit, but it's good for now. So let's move on to the large tree in the foreground. I'll also utilize the Puppet Warp Pin tool for this motion using the same process. I'll add my pins to the layer, then delete the keyframes to the pins I do not plan to move. This is not a necessary component to the process, but it can certainly simplify your timeline. Since the tree is much closer to the viewer and we're not seeing the very top of the tree, the movement's going to be pretty significantly less than what I've set up in the background trees. So I'm also going to create a few more keyframes of movement before setting up the loop out ping pong expression to make the movement feel a bit more organic. And lastly, I'll use the Puppet Warp tool to make Jon Snow breathe slightly. While the character is not really the main focus for this project, I've decided to add a bit of movement to him as well. Just like with the trees, I'm adding the Puppet Warp pins in the areas I don't plan on moving first, and deleting their corresponding keyframes. Then I'll add the pins in the areas I do plan to move. After moving the timeline indicator, I'll start to move my pins to their ending location. add Easy Ease, hotkey F9, and add the loop out ping pong expression. Now we're done with the Puppet Warp tool. Let's watch the playback. The next step I'm taking is to add the simple blink to Jon Snow. I've already imported this closed eyelid layer that was part of my PSD. So this will be a few simple keyframes in the opacity of the eyelid layer and copying and pasting them down to the timeline. After selecting the eyelid layer, I'll press T to show the opacity property, then make my first keyframe by changing the opacity to 0. Move the timeline indicator and type 100 for the opacity to create a new keyframe. Then I can copy my first 0% keyframe and paste it directly to the left and right of my 100% keyframe. Next, I'll click and drag to select this group of keyframes and paste them down the timeline. You can add a loop out expression here instead. However, I want the blinking to feel a bit more organic by having the timing between each blink slightly different. Next up, I'm going to make the guards in the background start patrolling the castle. I'll select the first guard, press P to open the position property. I'll click the stopwatch to enable keyframes. Then move the timeline indicator to when I want the guard to turn around. Now I'll click and drag the guard to its turning point in the composition. Notice a new keyframe is created. I can pull the timeline indicator through the timeline to see new movement. I do want the guard to now walk in the opposite direction, back towards the left side of the composition. So I'll move the timeline indicator, then click and drag the guard to its next turning point. When we watch this, we see that the guard is moving to the correct spots. However, he's kind of doing the moonwalk once he leaves the tower. We need to flip him horizontally. To resolve this issue, we'll press S for scale. If I click and drag on these values, it'll enlarge and shrink the designated layer proportionately. To make my guard turn around, I'll unclick the Constrain Aspect Ratio button, which kind of looks like the two chain links connected. Then I can change the X and Y scale of their layer independently. I'm going to click on the left number, copy this number, shortcuts Apple C, then type negative and paste the number back. We now see the guard is facing the other direction and has kept the same proportion and size. I want this change in direction to happen very quickly, so I'll need to copy and paste the original keyframe directly to the new one. I'm continuing the same process at any point that the guard changes directions. I want to add another guard at this bottom tower. With the guard layer selected, I'll duplicate it by hitting Apple D. We see the position and scale keyframes have been duplicated as well. Changing the timeline of this guard's walking is as simple as selecting the keyframes and dragging them to a new spot on the timeline. I've repeated the same process for the guard at the top tower, and we'll take a look at the playback. I want the light in the tower to look as if though it's being turned on when the guard first walks into the tower. First, I'm going to select the light layer and press T for opacity. I'll click the stopwatch to enable keyframes and type in 0 for the first keyframe. Then I'll move the timeline indicator to where the guard is in the tower, and then type in 100%. I'm going to add a feathered mask to this layer as well, so the light appears to be getting dimmer as it moves away from its center point. With the layer still selected, I'll select the circle shape, move the timeline indicator to the beginning, and then click and drag a circle around the area I want the light to illuminate. Since the mask is set to add, the light layer will only show inside of the circle. I want the light to slowly fade though, instead of being cut off this harshly. So I'll locate the mask's feather property in its drop-down properties. Then I can click on the number and drag it to the right to increase its size. The higher this number, the more gradual the transition of the mask will be. I'll use the selection tool to make my oval mask a bit oblong, so the light will come further into the composition. Increase the feather a bit more. and we can see that at the center point of the mask, the layer is at its full opacity, and then slowly fades as we get to the outside of the mask. Lastly, since I don't want this change to happen gradually, I want the 0% keyframe and the 100% keyframe to be directly next to each other. Let's watch the playback. Next up, I'm going to add movement to the gate. The movement of the gate is going to be a simple position movement. I'll select the gate layer, press P to open the position property, move the gate to its starting point, click the stopwatch to enable keyframing, and I'll move this keyframe to where I want the motion to start. Then move the timeline indicator to where I want the motion to stop. Then click and drag the gate to the end point of the movement. I do plan for the gate to open as well, so I can copy and paste these two keyframes down the timeline to make this motion occur. The playback is looking about right, but I'll be needing to use a mask to hide where the top part starts. This issue could have been resolved in Photoshop if I had the castle on the right side of the composition on a separate layer as the environment behind it. But since they are on one layer, I'll just use a mask. Since the gate layer has motion, it will be slightly more complicated, as I'll need to track matte the gate layer to a mask layer. First, I'll create a new solid. I'm selecting a bright color so I know it's a mask, but this color won't be showcased in the final composition. With this new solid selected, I'll press the eye icon next to it so the fill is not visible. Then, using the pen tool, I'll roughly trace the opening of where I want the gate to appear. Since I want the gate to appear within the mask's edges, I want it to be set at Add. Next, I'm going to change the gate layer to Alpha Matte Gate Mask. This will link the gate layer to the mask I've just created. I'm going to make a few minor adjustments here. To adjust the points in my mask, I'll need to select the fill layer and then select the actual mask 1 property. Now I can use the pen tool to adjust the angles. I've planned for the sky to slowly pan from one side to the other, and accomplishing this is simple. I'll select the sky layer and make it a bit larger by just clicking and dragging the corner in the composition window and align it to the desired location. I'll press P to pull up its position property, click the stopwatch to enable keyframes, move the timeline indicator towards the end of the timeline, and then click and drag the sky layer to the right of the composition. By holding Shift while I do this, it will lock the direction into a perfect horizontal movement. Add Easy Ease, hotkey F9, and that's that. I'm adding 2 more elements for our motion, and it'll be the first time we've looked at these effects and presets available within After Effects. We'll start with the flag. I want the flag on the castle here to appear that it's being blown in the wind a bit. This could be accomplished with the Puppet Warp Pin tool with a bunch of pins, but an alternative way of accomplishing this is to use the Turbulent Displace effect. This can be found by searching for it in the Effects and Presets panel. Then I'll click and drag this onto the layer. Notice, an options panel opens towards the left of my screen with all sorts of options for this effect. Many of these adjustments can be experimented with. The amount represents how displaced the layer is, and the size represents how big the displacements are. The 2 characteristics that I'm going to use to add motion to the flag are the offset and evolution. So I'll go ahead and click the stopwatch by these to enable their keyframes. With the flag layer selected, I can press U to bring up these keyframes in the timeline. Then I'll move the timeline indicator to the end of the composition. The offset gets adjusted by clicking and dragging it within the composition panel. This represents the wind that's being pushed through the flag. Then, we can change the evolution, which represents any change in direction with the wind. With a few more minor adjustments, we have a flag blowing a bit in the wind. Lastly, let's make our snow. In my original illustration, the individual snowflakes were just round circles. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'll start off by making a new shape layer, selecting the circle tool, holding shift, then click and drag to create a perfect circle. I can adjust the color to be white and name my layer Snowflake. Next, I will make a solid layer, name it, the color doesn't really matter here, and I'm going to search for the CC particle world in the effects and presets. Once found, I'll click and drag this onto my new solid layer. Let's see what this looks like. Alright, now let's turn that into snow. First step is to turn the particles type to textured disk and change the texture layer to my snowflakes layer. This is linking the shape of my circular snowflake to this effect. I want the snowflakes to be white, so I'll change both the birth color and death color to white. The snowflakes currently are on the larger side, so I can make them smaller by changing the birth size. I want them to stay the same size throughout the animation, so I'll match the death size to the birth size. I do want there to be a bit of variation of size from one snowflake to the next, so I can adjust that at size variation. And I'm lowering the max opacity a bit so the snow is not too detracting from the illustration. Making some progress. I'll jump into the physics of the particles, changing the animation to twirl. Next, I'll lower the gravity and velocity to better match what I want the snowfall to look like. Then I'll jump over to the producer. These options all represent the area that produces these snowflake particles, the producer. I'm going to expand the radius X and Y to cover the entire composition. Then I'll make the radius Z a bit larger as well to add a bit of depth to our snowflakes field. And I'll move the position Y above my illustration so all the snowflakes are being made from above it. I'll then lower the birth rate, which is how quickly the particles are being created, and increase the longevity so the snowflakes stay present until they reach the bottom of the composition. After a few more tweaks, the snowflakes are still falling a bit faster than I want, so I'm going to add a bit of resistance to make them fall a bit slower. That's looking pretty good. So I've gone ahead and added in a few solid fill layers, my logo, and the type for my website at the end of the composition, just like I did with the gray character animation. And then I've added in my sound effects and music, adjusted the timing a bit for a few of the motions, so now let's export. Composition, add to render queue. We're using the same settings here. Render settings at best settings, click on lossless, QuickTime Apple ProRes 4444. Press render. My rendered file is done as a .mov. Now I'll switch over to Media Encoder, drag and drop my .mov file, check my settings, which are the same settings we've been using in the class, H.264, match source, high bitrate, make sure export videos and export audio are clicked, then press OK. Then click the green arrow. Our new .mp4 is a fraction of the size of the original, going from about 1 gig down to about 34 megabytes, and it's ready to upload to social media. So let's go ahead and watch the final composition. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope it's given you some ideas for your upcoming projects. Best of luck.